At 5:44 on August 7th, 1944, Staff Sergeant Tommy Reed climbed into the bomb bay of a B-24 Liberator at San Giovanni Airfield, Italy, with a flashlight in his teeth and his fingers already numb from the morning chill. He was 22 years old, an American armorer from Kansas, and he was staring at 2,500-pound bombs hanging beneath the fuselage like a row of steel gravestones. The aircraft's manifest called them stores. Reed called them what they were: 10,000 pounds of high explosive that would either leave the plane cleanly over Romania or come home armed and waiting for a bump on landing. The Liberator's bomb bay was a narrow metal corridor, about 12 feet long, filled with hydraulic lines, electrical cables, and the constant smell of fuel vapor trapped in riveted seams. 2 racks ran along the sides, each rack holding 10 bombs, each bomb locked by a pair of hooks held shut by a small steel retaining pin. When the bombardier flipped the release switch, a solenoid should yank the pin, the hooks should open, and gravity should do the rest. Should was the word that killed people. Reed had seen it 3 times in the last 6 weeks. Bombs that refused to drop. The official term was hung ordnance, a phrase clean enough to type into a report, not nearly honest enough to describe what it meant. Hung bombs meant you flew home with live explosives still in the bay, because once the fuses were armed and the doors had been opened at altitude, you couldn't pretend the weapons were inert. You were carrying a moving accident. If the aircraft hit the runway too hard, if the landing gear bounced, if a rack flexed, if a hook released at the wrong time, 10,000 pounds could detonate under your own crew and scatter pieces of Liberator across the airfield like confetti. The doctrine for hung ordnance was simple: land gently, clear the runway, let EOD handle it. That doctrine assumed you had time. Combat didn't. Reed crawled forward between the racks and checked the safety wires on the arming vanes, the cotter pins, the alignment of the hooks. His flashlight beam shook with the vibration of engines starting on other planes nearby. Outside, ground crews moved like shadows between revetments, loading fuel, checking tires, shouting muffled words through scarves. Far down the line, another B-24 coughed to life, its 4 engines spitting smoke, the sound rolling across the field like an approaching storm. Reed stopped at the right rack. He tapped the release solenoid housing with his knuckle. Habit, superstition, instinct. The metal felt colder than it should. The night air had dropped near 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but at altitude, the bomb bay would see -40 degrees Fahrenheit or worse. In that cold, hydraulic fluid thickened, electrical contacts shrank, and any trace of moisture turned into ice. A mechanism that worked perfectly at 6 o'clock could freeze into uselessness by 10 o'clock over the Balkans. Reed slid out of the bomb bay and dropped to the tarmac. The Liberator's crew chief, Technical Sergeant Lou Ramirez, was waiting by the nose with a clipboard and a cigarette that refused to stay lit in the wind. "You're late," Ramirez said, not looking up. "I'm early," Reed answered. "You just want to take off." Ramirez finally glanced at him. "You find something?" Reed hesitated. That pause mattered, because what he was about to say was not in any manual. "The right rack solenoid feels stiff," Reed said. "And the wiring harness on ship 42 came back yesterday with flak cuts. If we lose power to release, we're bringing them home." Ramirez blew smoke through his nose. "That's why we got checklist. Bombardier hits primary. If it hangs, he hits alternate." "And if both are dead?" Reed asked. Ramirez shrugged like it was a weather problem. "Then you land gentle and pray." Reed looked past him at the row of Liberators. He had counted them this morning out of habit. 36 aircraft scheduled, each one carrying between 8,000 and 12,000 pounds of bombs depending on loadout. That was not firepower. That was liability. It was an entire airfield sitting on explosives. Praying isn't a mechanism, Reed said. Ramirez's eyes narrowed. What are you proposing? Reed didn't say it yet. He needed to be sure the numbers were real enough to justify the risk. He had kept his own tally in the margin of a grease-stained notebook because the official logs didn't capture how often hung ordnance actually happened. They captured what got reported, not what crews whispered about after landing. In July alone, Reed's squadron had flown 19 missions deep into Romania and Hungary. He had personally handled 9 aircraft that returned with at least one hung bomb. 9. That wasn't rare. That was a pattern. And patterns meant a mechanical cause, not bad luck. He had also watched what it did to crews. On July 22nd, a liberator named June Bug came back with 2 500-pounders still locked. The pilot tried to set it down soft, but the right main gear hit a rut and bounced. The bomb bay rack flexed. One hook partially released. The bomb swung, hard, and slammed into the opposite rack with a sound that made every man on the field freeze. EOD sprinted toward the aircraft like it was already burning. The bomb didn't detonate, not because it was safe, but because the world sometimes lets you survive something you didn't earn. The crew chief threw up behind a fuel truck afterward, shaking so violently he couldn't hold a wrench. Reed remembered that sound more than he remembered any flak burst. It was the sound of a weapon nearly turning inward. So he did the thing armorers weren't supposed to do. He questioned the doctrine out loud. What if we don't accept that the release is either electric or nothing? Reed said. Ramirez stared. It's electric. That's how it works. Reed nodded. That's how it's built, not how it has to fail. Ramirez took a step closer, lowering his voice. Reed, you touch that rack without orders and something happens, they'll hang you. They'll bury us if we don't, Reed said. Ramirez's cigarette finally lit. He took a drag, eyes fixed on Reed as if trying to decide whether he was looking at initiative or insanity. Okay, he said. Say it. Reed pointed toward the waist hatch. Give the crew a manual pull, something mechanical, a way to yank the pin if the solenoid freezes, a backup that doesn't care about power. Ramirez scoffed. You want a man in flight to reach into the bay and pull a pin holding a live bomb rack? I want a man to have a choice, Reed replied. Right now, he doesn't. That was the true hook of the problem. Not bravery, not enemy action, choice. The doctrine assumed systems worked until they didn't, and when they didn't, the crew accepted risk on landing like it was natural law. Reed hated that. He had grown up fixing farm machinery with baling wire and scrap bolts because you didn't have the luxury of waiting for a factory part. He didn't see why a bomber should be different. Ramirez exhaled slowly. What are you using? Rope? Reed shook his head immediately. Rope freezes, swells, snaps. I want steel. Ramirez looked back at the aircraft, then at Reed. You got 5 minutes before they start taxiing. Reed didn't waste a second. He jogged to the maintenance tent where salvaged parts were piled in crates. Bent gun mounts, shredded oxygen hoses, coils of cable, and a box of safety wire that cost almost nothing and held almost everything together on an airplane. He yanked out a coil of .041-inch stainless safety wire, the kind used to keep bolts from backing out under vibration. He grabbed a length of control cable scavenged from a wrecked aircraft, thin, braided steel with a smooth sheath, and a pair of pliers worn down from months of twisting wire in the dark. Back at Lucky Lady, Reed climbed into the bomb bay again. The engines were still off, but the airframe vibrated faintly from nearby aircraft starting. He positioned the flashlight beam on the release pin assembly and stared at it like a puzzle. The pin was held by a small lever arm connected to the solenoid. If he could attach a cable to that lever arm without interfering with normal release, then a man could yank it by hand if the solenoid failed. It was simple in concept. It was terrifying in reality, because any accidental pull on the ground could drop bombs on the ramp. Any snagged cable in turbulence could half-release a rack. Any wrong routing could jam the doors. And if the modification caused even one accident, Reed wouldn't just be blamed. He would be used as an example. He worked anyway. He looped the safety wire around the lever arm in a tight twist, making a small eyelet, then threaded the cable through and secured it with another twist, checking the clearance so the solenoid could still move freely. He tugged lightly. The lever arm shifted. Good. He tugged again, harder. The pin began to slide, but didn't fully release. Reed adjusted the angle, retwisted the wire, and pulled once more. This time the pin snapped back into position with a clean metallic click. Movement without release. Control without disaster. "Talk to me," Ramirez shouted from the hatch. Reed looked up, sweat already on his forehead, despite the morning cold. "I can move the lever by hand," he yelled. "If I route the cable to the waist, the gunner can pull it if the electrics die." Ramirez didn't hesitate the way Reed expected. He just said, "How many racks?" Reed blinked. "All of them." Ramirez cursed quietly. "How long?" Reed did the math in his head. Not theoretical math. The real kind. How fast his hands could move. How long it took to twist wire properly. How many times he'd have to check clearance. 10 minutes per rack, he said. Maybe less. Ramirez looked at the flight line. Men were already climbing into aircraft. A jeep rolled past, towing an ammunition cart. Somewhere, an officer shouted a time check. Ramirez leaned in closer, face hard. "You got 30 minutes, he said. "Then they taxi whether you're done or not." 30 minutes to modify a bomber carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs with a 9-cent piece of wire. Reed swallowed once and went back to work. If you want to see what happened when the release circuit got cut by Flak at 20,000 feet, and whether Reed's cable saved Lucky Lady or killed her, keep watching. Because the first time they pulled that cable in the air, it wasn't a drill. It was a choice between landing with live bombs or trusting a mechanic's improvised fix with 11 lives hanging on it. Reed slid out of the bomb bay as the ground crew pulled chocks, the Liberator's engines now running at full idle, propellers chopping the air into white discs. He jumped clear and stood watching as the aircraft rolled forward, tail swinging slightly, the nose dipping with each bump in the dirt strip. The cable was already inside. The safety wire was twisted tight. There was nothing left to adjust. Whatever he had built would either work or it would fail where no one could reach it. The aircraft lifted off at 7:14, heavy and slow, climbing toward the Adriatic with a full bomb load. Reed followed it with his eyes until it disappeared into haze, then realized he had forgotten to breathe. Around him, other bombers lifted one by one, the sound stacking until the entire airfield vibrated. 36 aircraft, 360,000 pounds of bombs, and at least one bomber carrying a modification nobody had signed off on. The mission briefing said Ploiești again. Same refineries, same flak belts, same problem that had killed crews for 2 years straight. Long exposure time over target and the highest concentration of anti-aircraft fire in Europe. Reed didn't need a map to picture it. He had memorized the routes because the routes dictated failure. Long climbs meant cold. Cold meant contraction. Contraction meant stuck pins. By 10:03, Lucky Lady was over Yugoslavia, cruising at 22,500 feet. Inside the bomb bay, the temperature had dropped far below freezing. The solenoids were cold-soaked. The wiring harness Reed had worried about was already stiff. No one on board knew it yet, but the electrical system that controlled the right rack was failing slowly, not catastrophically. Voltage sagging, resistance climbing. The kind of failure that didn't trip a warning light, the kind that waited. At 12:41, the first flak bursts appeared. The bombardier later said they looked lazy at first, black dots blooming well below the formation. Then the range tightened. The bursts climbed. The dots turned into violent concussions that shook teeth and rattled ribs. Lucky Lady flew straight and level because doctrine demanded it. The Norden bomb sight demanded it. Every second spent steady was a second the gunners couldn't maneuver out of the way. At 12:56, a flak fragment cut through the lower fuselage and detonated against the bomb bay bulkhead. The sound was not an explosion so much as a punch. Hard, metallic, final. The electrical bus feeding the right rack went dead. Nobody knew yet. At 13:02, the bombardier armed the bombs. The arming vanes spun in the slipstream. Fuses live now. Explosives committed. There was no safe way back. Either the bombs dropped, or they came home armed. At 13:08, the bombardier called out, "Stand by! Steady! Steady!" Then he toggled the release. The left rack went clean. 10 bombs dropped away, the aircraft shuddering as the weight vanished. The right rack stayed full. "Right rack hung," the bombardier said, voice flat, trained calm. He hit the alternate release. Nothing. The pilot felt the imbalance immediately. The Liberator yawed left, nose dipping slightly as the asymmetrical weight pulled against the airframe. "Confirm," the pilot said. "Right rack still loaded," the bombardier replied. No power. That was the moment Reed had built for. In the waist, Staff Sergeant Eddie Collins felt his stomach drop as he looked down at the loop of steel cable hanging beside him. He hadn't expected to use it on the first mission. Nobody ever did. Modifications always lived in the future, if something goes wrong. But something had gone wrong, exactly the way Reed predicted. Collins grabbed the loop and keyed the intercom. "Pilot, this is waste. We've got that manual release cable installed." There was a pause. 2 seconds. Long enough for every man on board to imagine the consequences of saying yes. "Do it," the pilot said. Collins wrapped the cable around his glove and pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled again, harder, bracing one foot against the fuselage frame. He could feel resistance deep in the aircraft, a mechanical fight happening where he couldn't see it. The cable stretched slightly, the safety wire groaning but holding. He pulled a third time with everything he had. The pin released. The right rack let go in a delayed, uneven motion. One hook first, then the other, and the remaining 10 bombs fell free, tumbling end over end into smoke and cloud. The Liberator jumped upward, suddenly balanced. "They're gone," Collins said, breathing hard. The cockpit erupted in noise, relief, disbelief, adrenaline dumping all at once. The bombardier laughed once, sharp and uncontrolled. The pilot swore. The engineer slammed a fist into the panel. Lucky Lady exited the target area intact. If the story ended there, Reed's cable would have been a lucky trick. A footnote. One aircraft, one mission. But war doesn't reward single data points. It rewards patterns. The pattern emerged fast. 3 days later, on August 10th, another B-24 from the same group returned with 2 hung bombs. Left rack this time, after icing locked the solenoid. The crew chief had installed Reed's cable the night before. The waist gunner pulled. The bombs dropped. No incident. On August 14th, a Liberator took flak that shredded its bomb release wiring entirely. Both racks hung. The aircraft was forced to abort early, but over the Adriatic, with fuel low and flak damage worsening, the crew pulled both cables manually and jettisoned the load safely. The bomber landed light instead of heavy. Nobody died on the runway. By August 18th, Reed had personally installed the cable system on 11 aircraft. He kept notes, times, failures, outcomes. He wrote them in pencil because ink froze at altitude and because he didn't want anything permanent yet. This wasn't doctrine. This was evidence. The resistance came next. An ordnance lieutenant called Reed into a tent on the 19th and asked him, very politely, why he was altering approved release mechanisms without authorization. Reed answered with numbers. 9 hung bomb incidents in July, he said. 4 in the first 2 weeks of August. 0 catastrophic releases on aircraft with the cable. The lieutenant frowned. That doesn't mean the cable caused the outcome. No, Reed said. But it changed the choice set. Crews don't have to land with live bombs. The lieutenant tapped his pen. And if a waist gunner pulls it accidentally on the ground? Reed didn't flinch. Then the safety wire breaks, he said. It's rated to fail before the pin releases, unless there's sustained force. I tested it. You tested it, the lieutenant repeated. Yes, sir. That was the problem. Reed was right, but he wasn't authorized. The compromise was quiet. The lieutenant didn't approve the modification officially. He also didn't order Reed to stop. Instead, he asked for drawings. Reed drew them on a piece of plywood with a grease pencil, labeling parts by hand. The lieutenant photographed it and said nothing more. By the end of August, 27 aircraft carried the cable. German fighters noticed nothing. Flak crews noticed nothing. But maintenance logs did. The number of hung bomb returns dropped. The number of dangerous landings dropped. The number of aircraft written off due to internal explosions dropped to 0 in Reed's group. The enemy never adapts to what it cannot see. But war has a way of charging interest. On September 2nd, a liberator named Red Dice took a direct flak hit to the bomb bay during a raid on Budapest. The explosion severed hydraulic lines and deformed the rack frame itself. When the waist gunner pulled the cable, the pin released, but the warped rack twisted instead of opening cleanly. 1 bomb fell. 1 stayed. Now the aircraft was worse off than before. A single live bomb swinging in the bay, arming vanes spinning, mass shifting violently with turbulence. The crew faced the nightmare Reed had feared, but not yet seen. The scenario where manual intervention didn't solve the problem, only changed it. The pilot shouted for options. There were none in the manual, and that was when the real cost of Reed's idea appeared, not in success, but in its limits. If you want to see what happened to Red Dice, and how a solution that saved dozens of crews nearly killed one entire bomber in seconds, say the word. The Liberator Red Dice began its descent at 1427 with 1 bomb still alive in the bay. Not hung, not secure, alive. The bomb had partially released when the cable was pulled. 1 hook let go. The other, twisted by flak damage, held just enough to keep the weapon from falling free. The result was a 500-pound bomb swinging on a single point, its arming vane spinning in the slipstream like a coin flicked into the air. Every oscillation sent shock loads through the rack frame. Every shock made the next oscillation worse. Inside the aircraft, men felt it before they understood it. The pilot felt a rhythmic pull through the controls, a low-frequency shudder that didn't match engine vibration or turbulence. The engineer saw it in the gauges, small, irregular spikes in structural stress readings. The waist gunner saw it directly, steel moving where steel was never meant to move. He keyed the intercom. "Bombs swinging," he said. Nobody answered at first. The doctrine for a hung bomb assumed the weapon was still. This wasn't. This was dynamic failure. The manuals had no page for it because no one had planned for a man to pull a release cable at altitude on a rack already deformed by flak. "Can we drop it?" the co-pilot asked. The bombardier shook his head, though no one could see him. Not without tearing the bay open. They were 120 miles from the Adriatic, too far inland to ditch safely, too close to enemy airspace to slow down. And landing with a swinging bomb meant betting 11 lives on whether physics would get bored before the runway arrived. The pilot made the call that saved them. "Cut power, reduce airspeed," he said. Slowing a bomber with an unstable internal load was counterintuitive and dangerous. Lower airspeed reduced aerodynamic forces on the bomb, but it also reduced control authority. It made the aircraft more vulnerable to fighters and flak. But the alternative was letting the oscillations grow until the rack failed completely. They throttled back. The swinging eased, not stopped, eased. At 15:02, German fighters appeared at long range. 2 dots, then 4, pacing the formation. They saw the bomber lagging, felt the invitation. The gunners opened fire early, tracers reaching out at 700 yards, not to hit, but to warn. The fighters broke off, unwilling to commit to a slow, damaged aircraft that still fought back. By 1549, red dice crossed the Adriatic. The bomb was still there. They landed at 1637. The touchdown was the longest 10 seconds of every man's life. The pilot held the nose off as long as he could, easing the main gear down with almost surgical precision. The bomb swung once, hard, as the wheels hit, but the rack held. EOD swarmed the aircraft before the engines fully spooled down. They cut the bomb free and dragged it clear with ropes, like men pulling a live animal out of a trap. No explosion, no casualties. But the incident changed everything. Within 48 hours, an ordnance review was called. Not an investigation, those came later, but a review. Reed was summoned again, this time to a table with 3 officers and a stack of reports. One of them slid the red dice incident across the table without looking at him. "This," the major said, tapping the paper, "is why unauthorized modifications get people killed." Reed didn't argue. He didn't defend the cable. He pointed to the second page of the report. "The bomb didn't detonate," he said. "If it had hung without a manual option, they'd have landed heavy, with flak damage, with a damaged rack. The outcome would have been worse." The major leaned back. "Or," he said, "the modification created a new failure mode." Reed nodded. It did. Silence followed. Not disagreement. Processing. War didn't care about perfection. It cared about relative risk. Over the next week, Reed worked with EOD and maintenance to add a change he hadn't wanted to admit was necessary, a secondary shear point. The cable would still pull the pin, but if the rack was deformed, the safety wire would fail before allowing a partial release. It was ugly engineering. It reduced the chance of the red dice scenario at the cost of sometimes losing the manual option entirely. Reed accepted it, because doctrine evolves by surviving its own mistakes. By September 12th, the updated cable configuration was installed on 41 aircraft. By September 30th, the number was 78. Hung bomb incidents continued to occur, but catastrophic outcomes didn't. The Germans never noticed the cable, but they noticed something else. Bombers were returning more consistently. Fewer emergency landings, fewer internal explosions on airfields, fewer aircraft lost after target. German intelligence reports began noting that American bombers demonstrate improved reliability following damage to bomb release systems. They didn't know why. They only knew the window of exploitation was narrowing. By October, escort fighters ranged farther. Flak accuracy degraded as crews thinned. The war shifted for many reasons. Reed never claimed credit for any of it. He only knew one truth. Fewer men were dying from their own weapons. In late October, Reed was transferred stateside. No ceremony, no citation, just orders. He spent the rest of the war teaching armorers how to think about failure. Not how to follow a checklist, but how to anticipate what breaks when the checklist stops making sense. He told them one thing over and over. Every weapon points two directions. Make sure you know how to turn it off. After the war, the liberators vanished from the skies. The bomb bays rusted. The cables were scrapped. But the lesson didn't disappear. It just stopped being visible. Military history remembers victories. It remembers aircraft. It remembers raids. It rarely remembers the men who made sure bombs didn't come home alive. If this story held your attention, hit the like button. It helps stories like this survive. Subscribe if you want more real World War II history. No myths, no shortcuts, just the mechanics of survival. By October 1944, the 15th Air Force stopped talking about the cable and started talking about outcomes. Not in speeches, not in briefings, in numbers. Maintenance reports showed a shift that didn't make headlines, but altered daily risk. Aircraft returning with hung ordnance still appeared. War didn't stop breaking machines, but the number of runway incidents involving live bombs dropped sharply in Reed's group. Emergency cordons became rarer. EOD calls decreased. Aircraft that once would have been written off after internal damage were repaired and flown again. The change wasn't dramatic enough to celebrate. It was too quiet for that. But quiet was exactly what ground crews wanted. The cable never became an official system. It remained a field expedient, passed by word of mouth, drawn on scrap paper, adjusted by different hands for different aircraft. Some crews used thicker cable. Some added extra shear wire. Some rejected it entirely, trusting doctrine and luck. The Air Forces did not mandate it fleet-wide. They didn't need to. The idea had already spread to where it mattered. People who watched weapons fail for a living. By November, armorers arriving from the States asked about it without being prompted. "You're the guy with the manual release," one of them said to Reed. Reed shook his head. "I'm the guy who didn't like landing with bombs." That distinction mattered to him. War tends to simplify people into symbols, heroes, villains, innovators. Reed resisted all of it. He never claimed to have solved the problem. He only claimed to have reduced one kind of risk by accepting another earlier, when it could still be controlled. German intelligence never identified the modification. They didn't need to. By late 1944, their problems were larger. Fuel shortages grounded fighters. Training hours collapsed. Flak crews thinned. The air war tilted for reasons that had nothing to do with one armorer in Italy. And yet, inside the margins where men lived or died, the change held. In January 1945, a B-24 returning from Vienna landed with flak damage to the bomb bay and both release circuits dead. The crew jettisoned the entire load manually over the Adriatic and landed clean. The maintenance log noted it in a single line. Manual assist used. No incident. That was all. No medal citation ever mentioned the cable. No after-action report credited a specific armorer. That wasn't how credit worked in maintenance. Success meant nothing happened. Failure meant everyone knew your name. Reed left Italy in February 1945, reassigned to a training depot in the United States. The war was entering its final phase. New aircraft were arriving. New doctrines were forming. His days of crawling through cold bomb bays were over. At the depot, he taught young armorers how to arm bombs, how to inspect racks, how to read the subtle signs of stress and where that manual's glossed over. When they asked about combat, he didn't talk about flak or fighters. He talked about mechanisms. Every system has a point where it stops doing what it's supposed to, he told them. Your job is to figure out where that point is before the airplane finds it for you. He didn't draw the cable on the chalkboard. He didn't need to. The lesson was bigger than one fix. The war ended. The liberators were phased out. Bomb bays rusted in scrapyards. The safety wire went back to holding bolts instead of lives. Reed returned to Kansas. He married. He worked with machines again. Tractors, combines, anything with moving parts and tolerances that didn't care about good intentions. He rarely spoke about Italy. When he did, it was never about danger. It was about responsibility. Weapons are built to go one direction. War forces you to think about the other. In the decades that followed, military engineering grew more complex, not less. Redundancy became doctrine. Manual overrides became standard. Designers stopped assuming electricity would always be there. Somewhere inside that evolution lived a simple idea Reed never patented and never claimed ownership of. If a system can kill you when it fails, you should be able to shut it down by hand. History doesn't remember the men who prevented disasters that never happened. There are no photographs of bombs that didn't explode on runways. No memorials for aircraft that landed safely because someone added a backup nobody approved. But the men who walked away from those landings remembered. And sometimes, that's enough. If this story held your attention, hit the like button. It helps these quiet stories reach people who care about how wars are actually fought. Subscribe for more World War II history, focused not on myths, but on mechanics, decisions, and consequences.